Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another episode of the RTC Book Club. RTC Book Club is basically I choose a book that we are reading because I'm on a mission to read 12 Greek retellings this year, and I'm picking a book, I'm sharing it with you guys, and then if you want to join along, you get the book, you read it, and then you join the discussion on Instagram. We have a little chat group and we talk about the books in our book club over there, and it's really fun. And there's lots of fun things to talk about and lots of cool people who are all reading these books together. It's a little tiny community that I love, and it's a lot of fun. But I'm doing the thing I do where I share my review of the book here, and then we go over there and we talk about it. So this month of April, you guys, we read Daughters of Sparta by Claire Heywood, and you guys, this book was good. It was good. I don't feel like this is going to be a super long video like my other ones have been, because I don't have very strong feelings about this book, which was interesting. I'm very middle of the road on this book. I think it's like 7 wooden horses out of 10. It was a good book. It was fine. It was fine. I think is what I have to say. Just off the top, no spoilers. I'll let you know when I get to spoilers. But before we start, I want to let you guys know, in case you don't want to stay for the whole video, you just want to know what book we're reading next month. Next month we're reading HERC. I've been sitting on this book for quite a while, sort of dancing on whether or not I want to read it. I really like a Hercules-centered Greek retelling, but this is a feminist-centered retelling of the Heracles mythology through the eyes of the other people around them. I would like one from Heracles' perspective. But this one is the one we're going to go with because it's the one that's available. And I'm excited to read it, but I've been being a little wishy-washy about when and if I was going to read it and how and where, why, all the things. So we're doing it now. I'm going to rip the Band-Aid off. We're going to read it right now. So yes, this is next month's book. It is by Phoenicia Rogerson, HERC. I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping that it's exciting. I'm pretty sure it's going to be. All these books have been interesting and enjoyable to read. I'll say that. Even the frustrating ones have been enjoyable to read. So, yeah, I think this will be great. That's next month's book. This month's book, however, though, was Daughters of Sparta. So we're going to jump into it. I'll give you a warning when I get into spoilers. Although, I will say this was fairly faithful to the actual, myth of the Daughters of Sparta. Helen of Troy and her sister, Clytemnestra. So it's not really a spoiler if you know your historical mythology. But I'll let you know when I get into spoiler territory. But I don't think, like I said, I don't think this one's going to be super long because I didn't have a lot of strong feelings, which was surprising to me because I usually have very strong feelings for things. But for this book, essentially this is the story of, like I said, Helen of Troy and her sister Clytemnestra. It's a harder name for me to say, guys, bear with me. And it's told from both their perspectives, so they're alternating chapters, which I like. I like, bouncing back and forth between two perspectives. I enjoyed that about this book. I think it's really well written. I didn't find this book to be, hard to read at any point. The action moves along. It gets right into business. There's not a lot of, setup or dilly-dallying between places. It just goes from one event to the other in their lives. There's a lot of time jumps, which I was okay, I'm not, upset about that either. That works just fine. I would have just preferred them to say the year, the age that they were, as opposed to how many years it was, because every time they were Clytemnestra, 2 years later, I was how old was she last chapter? Do the math every single time, and I had to, struggle to remember how old they were throughout the story. So it might have just been nicer if she just said 19, and I could be oh, she's 19 now. Fantastic. I will say this story had a lot of strong, concepts and a lot of strong feelings. There are a lot of things I was ooh, I really feel that. I really can feel that. It resonated really deeply with, my own personal experiences living as a biological woman in this world. It was a lot to, deal with. And a lot of things that really, hit home for me. I was okay, yeah, I know where they're coming from. But then in other regards, I was wow, ancient Greece really sucked. And I was pretty grateful. I was feeling pretty grateful for, how far we've advanced in women's rights. We can get farther. But, like, how far we've come, because listening to how they were living their lives made me go, oh, that's balls. They spend the majority of their lives just spinning and weaving cloth, and that's awful to me. I would absolutely die. Not like because I have anything against weaving in particular. It's the idea of doing one thing for your entire life, and that being like your whole thing. That's what you do. You make cloth. Boo. Hate it. Don't sign me up for that life the next time around. But I liked the dynamic. Makes me sad is that they get separated very early on in the story, the two sisters do, and they don't get to see each other ever again. That's a spoiler, I'm sorry. But it made me very sad, because I would have liked to at least had like a midlife reconnection so that they could touch base on a couple of things maybe, but that didn't happen. And I don't think that happens in the myth either, which is fair. Like I said, this was a very faithful adaptation of the mythology. There's a couple of changes here and there, a little bit of stretching, a little bit of filling in the gap, but nothing that I thought was like too out of pocket or like inconsistent with the narrative being told. So it was a very good story overall. It was well written. I think I enjoyed Clytemnestra's chapters more than I enjoyed Helen's chapters, not because I thought Clytemnestra was more interesting. I thought Helen's like perspective was a little bit more interesting, a little bit more relatable from like my own personal perspective. But I just enjoyed Clytemnestra as a person more. She was a lot more down to earth and a lot more like rational and well grounded. And I think I maybe saw a little bit of myself in Helen of Troy. So I was like, nah, I don't like that, too much of that. It was really interesting. I will say I listened to this on Audible. That's how I listen to novels. That's usually how I consume long format books like this. The narrator was fine. She was fine for the thing. She did well as Helen and Clytemnestra. It was perfectly fine. The thing that killed me the entire time and like absolutely ruined my immersion was all the accents she did for all the male characters. And it was just specifically the male characters, but also not specifically. It was mostly the male characters. Occasionally it was a female character, because the voice, the reader was, she was British, and she would do these crazy Cockney accents for all the slaves, which I was like, that seems not the best. But also, she did even crazier accents for all the male characters, mostly because they were from like other countries other than Sparta. So like the ones from Mycenae, like Mycenae, Mycenian, so Mycenae, yes. And the ones from Troy had these crazy accents that I was like, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. Because, like, I couldn't place them, for starters. But also, like, when, like, ladies are pretending to be men, it sounded like ladies pretending to be men and not just somebody reading. And so it was hilarious. So completely ruined my immersion every time one of them spoke, but it wasn't so like distracting that I couldn't like follow along with what was happening in the book still. I was just like, ugh, okay. Sometimes it just made me crack up because it was so silly. But I did like just seeing sort of the story of Troy and the Trojan War and like the impact of that on the lives of the women who were experiencing it, because we usually get it from like the male perspective and the heroes and the things like that. So that was a really enjoyable part of the book. But like I said, I just feel so like middle of the road about this book that I don't have a lot of strong feelings. So we're just going to jump into spoilers now. So if you don't want the book to be spoiled more than I already have spoiled it, sorry, totally sorry. Here we go. Spoilers. So, yeah, I found Helen to be unlikable, more because I resonated with some of her thoughts and decisions. She found the concept of childbirth terrifying after she did it. I found it terrifying before I did it. So, and I never did it because of that. So, like, when she was like, no more children, I was like, I'm with you, sister. But I also feel like the perspective of her sort of selfishly choosing this life and then having to deal with the consequences when the life isn't what she thought it was going to be. Like, she left thinking she was getting more, but she was actually getting less. It was an interesting choice. I would have maybe preferred it to be less that, but like that's my more personal like spin on it, because I don't think like in the mythology part of it not in the historical part, but in the mythology part of it, Helen doesn't really have a choice. Aphrodite does that to her, makes her fall in love with Paris, and then the spell sort of wears off when she gets reunited with Menelaus. Or Menelaus. The way the reader pronounced all the names has now made me very confused on how they're pronounced, and I don't know like the ancient Greek pronunciation, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time there. I'm gonna say the names differently every time. But like at the end in the myth, Aphrodite removes the spell so that her and Menelaus can be like reunited properly, because she didn't want to go in the first place. Like she had no desire to leave Sparta. So like in the way that the story has it sort of more in the historical, less deity involved concept, where she chose to go and therefore had to deal with that, and then somehow still manages to reconcile that with her husband at the end of the story, which didn't make any sense to me. But then also, like, as a person who knows the like historical myth, the book sort of ends at the end of the fall of Troy, when Helen is reunited with her husband, and after Clytemnestra has killed Agamemnon. It ends right there, but their stories actually continue for a little bit after the fact, and neither of them continue happily. Like, they both have sad endings after everything is said and done. Because of all the scandal of Helen that she's caused, her and Menelaus can never actually settle down in Sparta. They have to continue to travel and depend on the generosity of others, and sometimes they're welcome, and sometimes they're not, and then eventually they're killed. And then the same thing with Clytemnestra. She ends up happy with her new husband, and no longer underneath the tyranny of her first husband, Agamemnon, but then she is eventually killed by her daughter, Electra, who was getting revenge for the death of her father. And she's assisted by her brother, and her son also dies. Like, it's just one of those things where, like, both their stories end bleakly even after they get their kind of happy ending, but the book ends like that's the end, like that's their happy ending, and they're just going to settle down with her new husband and her old husband in Helen's case, and everything's going to be fine. And that's not the case. So I was like, oh, what a weird stopping point when you know that the mythology continues and it ends poorly. And there was nothing else at the end of the book to be like, and then this happened. Nah, I stopped right there. I will say, I think the best part of this book for me was just going on the journey, and the fact that the story didn't spend too long in any one place. Like, every chapter was an event. It was something happening. It was getting some sort of point across or some sort of theme across in a way that made the book easy to read. It was very, very easy to read, easy to breeze through, and I didn't feel like I said, like any time was wasted. That was probably the highlight of this book for me, but everything else was just okay. Like, it was just all right, which is so weird. The book sort of starts out with Clytemnestra and Helen as children and like their little childhood sisterhood relationship, but is immediately bespoiled like in the first chapters, because Helen and Clytemnestra are playing outside, and they're approached by baby Theseus, who isn't a baby, he's like a teenager. And when Clytemnestra is like, they're playing pretend, right? Like, they're playing like kings and queens and witches and stuff. And so she goes to like find some herbs, so she's out of sight. And in those few minutes that she's not looking at her sister, Theseus abducts her and takes her away. And it's sort of implied that he may possibly have like assaulted her, but nobody really knows for sure. Helen never says. She says that he kissed her, but like other than that, nothing else is described. Everyone just assumes that possibly that's a thing that could happen. And then eventually later on down the road, Theseus starts bragging about like he did something to her. So there's a lot of questions on like the purity, quote unquote, of Helen, if she's been tarnished by Theseus's like time with her alone, which is disgusting. It was really upsetting to even like consider that as a possibility, but it speaks to, I guess, in the narrative about how men chose to objectify and desire her even from a very, very young age, which is icky. Theseus was icky, and thankfully none of that happened on page, so like we didn't have to watch any of that happen. It was just sort of told to us after the fact, which I appreciate. But because of that, like, the entirety of Clytemnestra's life is, like, thrown upside down. So not only is she upset and feeling, like, guilty and responsible for what happened to her sister, potentially under her watch, because she was the oldest of the two of them. She was not older than Theseus. She was younger than Theseus. But what happened while she was there, and, you know, that Theseus being able to sneak Helen away right underneath her nose, you know, she internalizes a lot of that and blames herself for it, all the way up until she finds out that she's being married off to a foreign king who's, like, freaking 20 years older than her, which is also icky and gross. I think he's only 15 years older than her, but it doesn't matter. It's basically 20. But she loses her position as the heiress of Sparta. So she was supposed to be queen of Sparta, but because they don't know if Helen's purity is intact, her dad has to make the decision to send the oldest child away to keep Helen there so she can be the heiress of Sparta, because otherwise they can't marry her off to anybody, because, like, the kings that would want her don't want her because they think that she's been tainted, which is such a gross, like, patriarchal thing. And that was, like, right in the beginning of the book, so I was like, oof, wow, holy cow, that's a lot to unpack. But also, like, one of those things that made me go, I'm so glad I don't live in that time, thank God, oh my God, thank you so much. So that was like that. And then, you know, she ends up, Clytemnestra ends up marrying Agamemnon, and, like, things seem kind of okay. He's, like, kind of a big old braggart, brutish sort of fellow, but he's not, like, mean to her. He's just kind of, like, it is what it is. And she turns out a bunch of children. I didn't realize how many children Clytemnestra had. She had a shit ton of children. And she was happy to do so. She was happy being a mother, happy to turn out these children, all the way up until, like, you know, like, she thought she was having a happy marriage, a happy life, until she realized that her husband was a big old jerk. He was a big old stinky head. Because he ended up taking a mistress, who didn't even want to be his mistress, which is a double layer of stink and funk. And she has to sort of, like, confront that. And when she's like, hey, I thought we had a thing. I thought we were all on the same page. I thought you liked me. Like, what's up with that? He then hits her and tells her not to tell, like, him what to do. So now she has to deal with the fact that not only is her husband, like, this gruff, abrasive, like, brutish sort of man, he's an abuser. But, like, a low-key abuser, because he doesn't do it outright to, like, you know, bully and victimize her. He's just like, I don't have to take shit from you because you're a woman, and I will continue to do things to put you in your place beneath me, because you're a lady. And that was another one of those things that made me go, oh my God, I'm so glad I don't live in this time, because I would be beheaded immediately. I do not have the chill for that. So that's all happening over, like, the course of a couple of years, from, like, the time she's, like, 12 to, like, 1922-ish. In that period of time, you know, all these things have happened. And that's just, like, really quickly. That's, like, a good third of the book. So we breeze right through that. And then while this is happening, you know, Helen's like, oh, everything was great. Everything was wonderful. Theseus was into me. Because she's a child. She was, like, 9 when this happened. And she grows up becoming the heiress. And she's like, ooh, I'm going to be a queen. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be wonderful. And then her husband turns out to be a but because, you know, Helen of Troy is supposed to be the most beautiful woman in all of Greece, and she's marketed that way. And then they even lean into the fact, like, it's implied, never discussed, that her mother was assaulted, but they don't say by whom. But because Helen is so beautiful and her hair is, like, super fiery red, she's the redhead in this picture, they think that she's been, like, touched by the sun, so she has to be the child of a god. So then it's sort of like this rumor starts, and her parents lean into it once they have to, like, marry her off and make her marketable, that she's actually the child of Zeus, which is in line with the mythology, her being a child of Zeus, and Zeus did assault her mother in the mythology, so, like, there's that. So it's never implied by her parents that it's actually Zeus's child, but it's more implied by her parents that her mother was assaulted, and her husband is really supportive of her regardless of this fact that, you know, she was assaulted, and supportive of the fact that they have a child. There's a whole little bit where Helen is trying to, like, reconcile her relationship with her mother, because her mother's a little bit standoffish. She's not, like, as into her as she is her other children, and so, like, those few moments that Helen gets attention from her mother are, like, her golden rainbow special moments, and that's really sad. It made me really sad to think about that reality. and how Helen never really knows that that's the case, like that her mother was assaulted and that's why she's treating her that way. She never knows that. She just grows up thinking her mom just doesn't like her as much as her other siblings for no reason. And then she ends up getting married to Menelaus, who is the brother of Agamemnon, Clytemnestra's husband. So he becomes the new king of Sparta. She becomes queen of Sparta, and turns out she's like, oh, everything is gross and icky, and he's also a weirdo. Like, he, on their marriage night, brings his buddy in to, like, check her out like she's a fucking horse in market. So they make her strip on her wedding night in front of her new husband and a stranger, and then he asks his friend to, like, assess whether she can give birth to a child, and he's like, nah, she's too young, bro, because she's, like, 14. So he decides to skip that sort of situation, because he can't put a baby in her, and then sort of ignores her for a little while until he can put a baby in her. And then when he does finally get her pregnant and she gives birth, turns out the birth was really problematic and she nearly died. So she was like unconscious or in bed for days recovering, and when she recovers from it, she's like, oh god, I never want to do that again. Like, that was awful. And then she starts to go through this process of, like, pushing her husband away and trying to come up with ways to, like, keep him away from her and, you know, pretend that she hasn't recovered because she doesn't want to have another child or go through the pains of labor again, which is very fair, very understandable, but she doesn't communicate that to her husband. She just does that and sort of causes this, like, rift to form between them. And, this is essentially what sets her on the path to the Trojan War, because she starts to create this distance between them. Her husband takes her slave, like, handmaiden. There's slaves in this book, too. That was surprising and upsetting, but also historically accurate, so I can't really argue it that much. But he ends up taking her slave handmaiden as his mistress, and she ends up getting pregnant with the child and giving birth to the son that he wanted all along, so everything turns out fine for him. But then Helen she finds this, like, old witchy woman in the woods who has a method of, like, birth control that she shares with her, and it's disgusting. But it works. And Helen continues to use it for a very long time, and it brings back some of the intimacy she has in her relationship, but it's still not, like, the same as it used to be, because she's still, like, a little bit hesitant about even attempting to, like, engage in intercourse, because the possibility of her getting pregnant is always there. And she feels that way all the way up until she fucking meets, like, fuckboy Paris, because he's absolutely a fuckboy in this story. And Paris basically just says a bunch of really nice things to her, calls her out for being super beautiful and sexy, and then while her husband is away, he's like, what if we, you know? And she doesn't when he's there, but when he's like, I'm gonna leave if you want to come with me, and she's like, oh, I kind of do, because my husband sucks and I don't want this. Mind you, at this time she has a daughter who she's already neglected too, because she doesn't feel attached to her child either. So she's like a really good example of what happens when you force a woman who doesn't want to have children, because she was not connecting with this child. She did not feel, like, in touch or connected to her daughter whatsoever. And she was okay foisting the responsibility of the care off onto her handmaiden, who was also a slave, but gonna let that go. And then, like, at some point in time becomes a little bit jealous of the fact that, like, her daughter doesn't have a relationship with her or love her as much as she loves her handmaiden, and, like, all those sorts of things. So there's a really interesting, like, dialogue there about, like, her experience as a woman and a mother who doesn't really want to be a mother, but doesn't want to lose all of the aspects of her relationship with her daughter. But also, she didn't have a mother figure as a model for herself, because her mom was also distant from her, so she didn't really get that, like, connection. She didn't get that understanding of what that means. So, like, you can see why that wouldn't translate to her own child. But she has a kid. She has like a grown little tiny child at the time that Paris shows up, and she's like, yeah, I'll leave, and I'll leave that kid. Fuck that kid. Fuck this man. So she joins Paris. Paris ends up stealing a bunch of gold from the city of Sparta, and therefore the king of Sparta. And when Menelaus returns and sees that his wife is gone, because all these guys showed up to, like, compete for Helen's hand, Odysseus came up with a plan to make them all swear their loyalty to the guy that ends up winning Helen's hand, so that if she's ever like taken away or lost or things like that, all of them will pledge their armies and their efforts to getting her back. And that's what happens is, because she leaves with Paris, all these other like Greek kings and royalty nobilities, warriors and stuff like that, have to then rise to the call of Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon, who really sort of takes over the whole war campaign. He's like, I'm going to be the general of this, because he has his eyes set on the riches of Troy. He doesn't actually care about Helen, and you get sort of the impression that nobody really cares about Helen except for maybe Menelaus. Everybody else is there for the glory and for the gold and what they can reap from the city of Troy. But they start this whole war, and Helen ends up going to Troy and realizing that after a while, all of like Paris's kind words and like pretty boy facade is a facade for a like cowardly, scummy, vain, self-important little jerk who is actually not in super love with her as much as he said he was. He's more in love with himself and more in love with the idea of being able to be the husband of the most beautiful woman in Greece, not really interested in the most beautiful woman in Greece. But to start this Trojan War, we have to deal with like the fact that Agamemnon at some point has angered a priest of of Artemis, by robbing the girl that he brought in as his mistress was actually supposed to become a priestess of Artemis. And since then, Artemis, who is not characterized in any way, shape, or form, it's just sort of said that this is all happening because he angered Artemis. Artemis has beef with Agamemnon, so like she injures him in a hunt by sending a boar his way, and then like later on when they're about to set sail to go to fight the Trojan War, she doesn't give them any of the winds. She doesn't release the winds in their sails, and the priest whose sister was supposed to be the priestess of Artemis that he ended up taking as his mistress, getting her pregnant, and she ends up dying from fever. Her and the baby end up dying. The priest is her brother. So the priest of Artemis, who was like, give me my sister back, and Agamemnon was like, no. And then when he finally got his sister back, she dies. He tells Agamemnon that the only way to satisfy Artemis is to sacrifice his daughter. And he's like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, fine. So they lure Iphigenia out there, and she's like a young girl, like 13-ish at the time, with the prospect of marrying Achilles. And they don't really tell Achilles that much about it, just that he needs to stand there for a second so that they can lure this girl under false pretenses to be sacrificed. But what they don't count on is that Clytemnestra was like, yeah, I'm not going to send my daughter to a war camp with a bunch of men for her wedding alone and just leave her with a strange man in the hopes that everything is okay. No, I'm going to go with her. I'm going to help get her ready for her wedding. And then I'm going to take her home because you guys are going to war and she's too young to, like, give birth to children or anything like that. So we're going to do the ceremony. She's coming home. So when Clytemnestra shows up, she gets told by one of the loyal slaves that used to be in her palace that this is the plan. They're gonna murder Iphigenia, and she's like, the fuck. So when she goes to confront Agamemnon about it, he hits her again and tells her it's gonna happen whether she wants to or not. There's nothing she can do to stop it, and she feels so helpless. And I'll tell you guys, like, that chapter alone where she's like helping her daughter get ready for this wedding and trying to like bolster her because she's nervous before her wedding, is heartbreaking. It's so gut-wrenching to just listen to her like have to talk about like what she thinks, like all her thoughts while she's like trying to watch her daughter be happy and try to keep her from having all this fear because she can't escape with her. They set guards with her, all this stuff with her to prevent her from escaping with her daughter, and she's just full of all this regret because she should never have brought her daughter there in the first place, and she knows that, but there's nothing she can do because she's sort of trapped in this cage of menning, and doing men things, and it's led her to this point. And they sacrifice her. They sacrifice her right in front of her. It's horrible. It's awful. And this is the point where, like, Clytemnestra, who had been the perfect model wife up to this point, she only deviated a little bit when she tried to help the slave girl escape Agamemnon's fucking clutches. But otherwise, like, she's been the picture perfect wife this entire time, done everything right like she's supposed to, and in return for that, she's repaid by having her child killed in front of her. And this is the point where she snaps, and she almost gets close to murdering Agamemnon, but doesn't get to do it at that time. They set sail for Troy. The Trojan War happens. A bunch of stuff happens in the meantime, but during the time that Agamemnon is gone, she takes a lover in the son of the former king of Mycenae, who tells her that he's going to help support her and protect her while her husband is away, because while she's running Mycenae, like, she needs a man to be around. Like, it's just sort of the way things are. Also, like, people might try to come and take over the kingdom, and she's just a woman, so, like, there's not a lot she can do. So she ends up falling in love with this guy who treats her immensely better than Agamemnon ever did. So she's very happy with him. Problem is that Electra absolutely resents her for taking another husband while her father is still alive, just away at war. The Trojan War lasts for 10 years, you guys. So it's a long, long-ass war. They're just waiting for Agamemnon to get killed in the war, and he doesn't, which is awful. But when they hear that he's coming home, her and her new husband sort to conspire to kill him together. So, like, couple goals, right? And basically, like, the rest of the story just sort of runs through the fall of Troy, how Helen has to deal with the fact that all the other women blame her constantly for the war, and every time their husbands or sons or brothers or fathers are murdered, she has to deal with their scrutiny, and she has to do it unsupported. Like, the royal family's not supporting her husband's not supporting her because he only cares about himself, and then she has to deal with the fact that her husband is also a coward on top of that, because when he does go out finally to fight the war, most of the time he was hiding with her or the women, but when he goes out to finally fight the war and, like, do a one-on-one combat that's gonna end the war depending on who wins, he chickens out and runs back inside, and she's embarrassed and humiliated by the guy that she thought was different, but he's not. Turns out to be a big loser. And essentially Troy falls. She gets reunited with her husband. Her friend in Troy, her only friend in Troy, becomes a slave to Agamemnon again. And you have to deal with, like, the harsh reality of this war, how women were treated when these wars happened. And there's even a point where one of the Trojans, her fellow Trojan, her brother-in-law technically, tries to assault her while Troy is burning, because he's so angry and mad at her for bringing this war upon them, when really, like, the war wasn't about her. And Paris's older brother, the one who's, like, leading the troops, Hector, even tells her at some point when he's injured and, like, staying with the injured people, he talks to her one-on-one finally and tells her, like, the war's not about her. It wasn't her fault whatsoever. They don't even, like, nobody thinks it's about her. She's just sort of become the figurehead of blame and fault for this war. They know it's all about the glory of the Greeks and them wanting the riches of Troy and those sort of things, and has really little to do with the fact that she's there. This was just their excuse to go to war, was that Helen was there. But otherwise, they would have gone to war if they could find another reason for it, to rob Troy of its riches. And that's sort of a little bit of, like, balm, a little bit of catharsis in the middle of all this fucked up chaos. But at the end of this, Agamemnon takes her friend Cassandra back home with him, and Menelaus takes his wife, and they go home, and they just sort of reconcile. They apologize to each other. They apologize for being bad at communication. He apologizes for not knowing how to deal with women, which made me sort of wonder if, like, him and his buddy, the one that he took with him on the wedding night, were actually, like, more than friends. And it was sort of kind of implying that maybe he wasn't really that into women in the first place, but it was, like, his duty to do this thing, and his brother set this whole thing up in motion for him anyways, so he's just going with his, like, role in life, like, in the same way that Helen was sort of forced into her own personal role in life. He was forced into his box, and they're just two unhappy people forced to be what they don't want to be together, and that's how this all broke down, like, the relationship broke down, which was interesting, but it wasn't explored as much as I would have preferred it to be explored. I would have liked her to just come out right and say, like, he was gay, and that was part of the problem in their whole, like, relationship dynamic, because he was just doing his duty and she didn't want to be there, like, those kind of things. Like, I would have liked to have that conversation, but it sort of walked the line but never actually said or stated those things outright. So that's sort of speculation on my own part and not really what's described in the book. And then by the time Agamemnon gets home with his new slave, they have set up this whole plan, Clytemnestra and her new husband, and they basically, like, Clytemnestra was not counting on him coming home with a concubine, like a trophy from war. So they were only planning to have him, like, take a bath and get ready without anybody around so that they could murder him. But then he insisted on taking this bath with his slave girl as well. So they had to get 2 baths. And because she asked for 2 baths, what happens is when she's in that room helping Agamemnon bathe, the slave girl is also there, Cassandra, is also there taking this bath. They didn't play up the fact, let me finish the story. I'll get back to Cassandra in a second. But, in the bath, she ends up stabbing Agamemnon, and then her husband shows up to help her stab him. And then she's thinking the entire time, like, while she's watching this whole thing go down with the 2 baths and the slave girl, she's like, okay, we're gonna kill Agamemnon, and then we're gonna help this girl out and tell her she's safe here. She doesn't have to worry about anything. But when she turns to, like, see what her husband is doing, he ends up killing the slave girl in the bathtub as well, and then tells her, well, I just figured that's what you wanted because you asked for 2 baths, which, like, feels like you just wanted to do some murder, sir, because this was also your revenge quest, and not really like a thing that your wife actually wanted, because you know full well your wife didn't want you to murder a woman. Come on now. But he says that, oh, like, you just said the thing, so I just did what I thought you wanted me to do, which is very typical and red flaggy, and I think probably the biggest red flag that they've shown on her new husband, but, like, they managed to work that out and reconcile that and move on, and she gets the catharsis of killing the person responsible for murdering her daughter, and not having to deal with, like, this oafish brute of, like, brutalizing her, abusing her, and making a mockery of her by continuously parading all of the women that he captures from other people in front of her. So, in the context of the story where it ends, she gets to have her happily ever after with her new husband, and Helen and Menelaus also seem to settle down to a happily ever after-ish sort of life, because it doesn't continue any point past this point in the story. To sort of circle a little bit back to Cassandra, in the mythology, she was, like, blessed and also cursed by Apollo to have visions of the future, but nobody would believe her. So she would be able to always see the future. Her visions would always be 100% accurate, but nobody would believe her. And she would, she predicted the fall of Troy. She told them everything, even about the horse. She was like, no, don't trust that. And nobody believed her, because that was her curse. And she has that very sad, tragic ending when she gets killed by Clytemnestra. Some people, like, some versions of the myth will say it's her and her husband. Some will just say Clytemnestra killed her. But she knows that she's going to die. And they allude to the fact that she's sort of knowing in the book, but they never outright say that she has visions or it's from Apollo. So there's not any sort of, like, interaction with the gods in the story, which is really interesting to me because it went more for the historical take than the mythological take. But in the context of the Trojan War, there's so much interference from the gods, like, they really get all their little fingers in there, to have that separated so completely to the point where, like, Cassandra doesn't even have vision, she just has feelings and a little bit of, like, knowing, and it never being mentioned was really interesting. But she knew in the story when Helen tried to free her from Agamemnon and then realized that she was Agamemnon's slave and had no, like, way to get her away from there, she told Helen that she was going to die. Like, this was going to be the end of her life. And she knew it was coming. So, like, those things. So it sort of implied she had visions, but yeah, that's basically everything I had to say and think about the Daughters of Sparta. It was a good book. I'm looking forward to reading HERC next month. I'm hoping it'll be slightly more excitable and a little less bleak. I think that's probably part of the reason I'm sort of middle of the road on Daughters of Sparta, is because it was pretty bleak, a little depressing book, but not a bad read overall. So yeah, that's everything I thought about it. If you made it to the end of the video, guys, I appreciate your faces, and I'll catch you guys all in the next one. Until then, happy crafting. Bye.